Hello, and welcome to our program. The title of this program is Until Help Arrives. The program was developed by the Federal Emergency Management Association, FEMA, and it was developed with the understanding and the premise, if you will, that in an emergency, if we are individually present at an emergency, you are the help until help arrives. I'm joined today by Thatcher Plante. Thatcher is Bedford's fire inspector. Thatcher is also an emergency medical technician. He's the expert up here, clearly far more than I. By further introduction, I am the director of the Bedford Community Emergency Response Team, and the Bedford CERT team has been running this program a few times throughout Bedford, and we hope to continue to do so. Our goal is to get this material into in front of as many people as possible because, again, studies have shown that in case of an emergency, the very first responder, in many cases that's you, can actually help to save lives. So I'm going to turn the program over to Thatcher.
Thank you for that introduction, Paul. So like he was saying, this is a relatively new program to the town of Bedford that we got from FEMA. And so if you are interested in having us come teach this program in person, please feel free to contact the Bedford Fire Department or the Bedford CERT team. And like Paul was saying, fire, police, EMS, we are considered the first responders, and CERT is then considered second responders. But like he was saying, before help arrives, oftentimes it will be the bystander who may be the only one on scene who can help until the first responders arrive. So we're going to get into this program and talk about what it is and what it's not. And yes, so there are some graphic images and a couple of 911 calls we listen to that you might find disturbing, but it's important stuff to talk about now. And yeah, the goal of the program is to teach you the basic skills. So this isn't going to make you an EMT. This is not a first aid CPR course, but it's going to give you everything you need to know about how to manage an emergency until help arrives, until police, fire, EMS gets on scene.
Okay, we can run the first video, please.
It was a little strange to sit down to someone that you've never met before and decide that you're going to grab their hand and tell them everything is okay.
I screamed. That's all I remember doing at that moment. I knew I was going to wreck.
I remember feeling like we had to do something immediately right now.
The day started out like any other day. Wasn't cold, wasn't hot. My friend called me that morning and he said, I'm gonna take out my Harley and you got your new bike. And so let's just go out and have some fun.
All of a sudden, I see the woman on the motorcycle just flying through the air. I just remember saying, stop the car.
I remember getting thrown headfirst over the motorcycle. And I heard them say, don't move, please don't move. Blood was streaming down and it went on into the gutter. There's still the mark of the blood.
And then when we pulled up and saw her, blood was rushing down out of her leg and into the gutter. My husband's cousin took his shirt off and immediately started applying pressure to stop the bleeding.
Keneal was holding my hand. I remember that distinctly. She was saying, you're gonna be okay. And to hear those words were so important.
I really feel bystanders have a responsibility to act. Don't be afraid. You're not going to hurt yourself. You're not going to hurt the patient. All you'll do is help, even if it's just a comforting hand.
Doing something is better than doing nothing. That helps us more than they would ever realize. That can make all the difference between life and death.
If you imagine yourself in a situation where you've been in an accident, you're vulnerable, you're frightened, think about what you would want.
So as you can see, there is a lot you can do before help arrives. In this case, they were able to provide some bleeding control, and like the woman in the video said, the source of comfort, just holding her hand and telling her help was on the way, everything's going to be okay, calling 911 so that help does arrive. So there is a lot you can do before help arrives, and like the doctor was saying, he feels everybody has a duty to render that aid until first responders arrive. So here we're going to look at not a motorcycle crash, but a car crash, and unfortunately we deal with these quite a bit here in Bedford. So in this case we have a motor vehicle accident, rollover, a car is on its roof. And so what do we have going on here?
Well, it looks like somebody's calling for help, somebody's on their cell phone.
Yep.
He looks like he's simultaneously trying to check on the injured person, maybe tell them, hey, things are going to be okay. Trying to find out exactly how injured they are. He's the first on the scene.
Absolutely. And so like you pointed out, he's got a cell phone in his hand. So he's probably calling 911, getting that help on the way, might be giving us all the information that we need to know. Is it a single patient, multiple patient? Is there fire, fluids leaking? It looks like he is at least comforting that person who's trapped in the car, maybe holding their hand, maybe assessing them, and absolutely, he's comforting them and getting help on the way. And so fortunately, this is one that we don't deal with here often in Bedford, so this is a lot larger scale. So what do we have going on in this one? What do you see here?
Well, unfortunately, I see a lot of injured people. I see people who I assume were probably also passengers on the train who are attempting to help their co-passengers. Unfortunately, I see things that I'd rather not see, like body parts. So it was obviously a fairly catastrophic event, and clearly it looks like lots of injured people with also a large number of people looking to help.
Yeah, absolutely. I see that as well. So like you said, right in the foreground, there's some nasty looking stuff, but the nature of being, not a first responder, but a bystander until help arrives, you don't have any obligation necessarily to go to that. Do what you can. We have people that it looks like they are assessing some people, they are doing some basic bleeding control, but a lot of people are just providing comfort. And it looks like we're moving some debris up in the background there. Looks like we're moving some debris. And in a lot of ways, just not making this situation worse is a very big help. And so then this one hits close to home here.
That looks like Boston.
Yeah, this is the Boston Marathon bombing. And so what do we see going on in this one?
Well, it looks like it just happened. We still see smoke, so I don't see any the real first responders present. I see a lot of people injured. I see a lot of people trying to help, but very clearly the emergency personnel have not yet arrived. And again, it also looks like a fairly catastrophic incident, as we all know it was.
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, there's still some smoke in the air. So this is, I would assume, very early on into the incident. So yeah, we don't see any first responders on scene, even though they were staged there and ready to respond. At this point, they're still trying to figure out what's going on. Because if you've seen any of the videos, it wasn't clear if this was fireworks gone wrong or what was going on. There was just two back-to-back explosions, and until the smoke clears, the dust settles, we don't really figure out quite what's going on. So it's going to be, a minute or two before those first responders get down here. So like we talked about in the last two pictures, we've got some bleeding control, some comforting, some assessing, and then just not getting hurt yourself. And so, yeah, these three that we talked about are the common in Bedford, and unfortunately in Bedford, I would say both of those are very rare, but nationwide, worldwide, you've got rare and very rare. So just something to be cognizant of, even us as the first responders. There's the incidents that we're comfortable dealing with, even though they're emergencies. We deal with them all the time, and then there's the ones where we have to take another second and take a breath before we go rushing in, because we don't deal with these all the time. And that's us as professional first responders. The person who does not have that training, you should take that breath on all of these scenarios, even the the ones that are common for fire and EMS.
Right, and as I expect you'll say even more as we go on, an individual responding as an individual should not make the situation worse by putting themselves in danger.
Exactly.
We should help when and where we can, when and where it's safe to help, but not at personal risk to ourselves necessarily.
Absolutely. Yep. And trust your gut when it comes to that. And so like we talked about, you really can make a difference. If you do nothing else other than ensure 911 has been called, that's huge. You can provide comfort. You can move the injured away from danger so that we don't further injure them. And people who aren't injured that might just kind of be shocked, kind of standing around, you can take them away from the scene so that they don't add to the casualty count, if you will. And then we'll talk about some basic bleeding control and first aid.
Can we have the second video, please?
Any first responder will tell you that it is rare, really rare, to show up on any scene, whether it's a fire, whether it's, someone sick, whether it's, a cat in a tree, where someone isn't trying to do something. We do a pretty good job as professional medical response. We do a good job getting there quickly, but when we get there and nothing's been done, when we get there and there's been a huge time lag, when you get there and it's been 30 minutes, and the person's now cold, and we know getting hypothermic, getting cold when you're traumatically injured kills you. We know that. The person is in a position where they can't breathe well, right? And they haven't been getting enough oxygen. That kills you. We know that. 30 minutes is a long time. The person who's bleeding and they continue to bleed and there's a giant puddle of blood on the ground which should be inside that person's body. We know that. So can we keep them alive? Maybe. But it's going to be way harder if we don't have that citizen helping us out. It's a team. We're a team. We're here to help you. We need you to help us.
People are afraid because they don't have formal training that they might make the situation worse. Really, it's very, very hard to make the situation worse. If you're in a situation where someone's suffering some kind of life-threatening emergency, it's pretty hard to make it worse for them than it already is. It's much better to try to do something. You're very unlikely to cause them harm. So it's better to, at least give it a shot. It's a difference between life and death for that person, because we are quick, but we're not that quick.
If people knew that they could intervene and do something immediately, would help enormous numbers of people. The worst thing you can do is just stand by and do nothing.
So I guess the message is, as good as the first responders are, 6 to 9 minute average response time, in fact, there are very often other people around within a minute or two, and there's things that they can do that can quite literally save lives. Studies have shown this.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that 6 to 9 minutes is a national average. Right. And what people have to understand is that's not 6 to 9 minutes of the apparatus on the road necessarily. That's 6 to 9 minutes from the time you call 911 till it goes to the 911 center, dispatch, then the trucks get on the road. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth later on. But so the big thing is yeah, it might be a few minutes before we get there, depending on where you are in town and if both ambulances are in service. We only have 2 ambulances in service. Right. They might already be on other calls. So somebody's going to come help. You might see a fire engine responding to an emergency medical call, and that's because the ambulances are tied up. So we do have EMTs and paramedics on the engines as well, and medical gear, so they can go and start rendering care before an ambulance gets there. And it might be a mutual aid ambulance. It might not be a Bedford ambulance. And the other point that they hit in the video, which was great, is don't be afraid that you're going to do harm. That person is receiving no care until the first responders arrive. Right. If you just stay there and you're worried that you're going to hurt them. Unless you try to do something you've seen on like MacGyver, you're really not going to do anything to harm the patient. You just need to you need to start doing what you think would be best, and that might just be calling 911, comforting them, removing them from danger. Right.
I guess the theme is you are the help until help arrives.
Exactly. And so this is the chain of survival. And if any of you are certified in CPR, there's the cardiac chain of survival, which is early recognition, early defibrillation, But this one's a little bit different. So like this, you were saying, this starts with you. First care is you, and non-medical first responders. So maybe that's a police officer or a firefighter, depending on what community they may or may not be trained in EMS. Pre-hospital medical care, now we're talking about the ambulances. That's the EMTs and the paramedics. Emergency medicine is your emergency department, the ER in the hospital. And then surgeons, depending on if it's an injury. If it's cardiac, maybe they're going to be going to the cardiac cath lab. And so if we break any of the links in that chain, it's going to be a worse outcome for the patient. You could have the best emergency room in the country or the best cardiac cath lab, but if we don't get them to that point where they would be viable, then it's all for naught. And so as you can see, first responders don't come in until the third link in the chain. So if we're not notified early and that first care isn't rendered by you, then we might not even have a chance at keeping them to the emergency room or surgery.
Right. The goal is keep them alive long enough for the first responders to do their job.
Absolutely.
What would cause somebody to, in general, you do this all the time. You're an emergency medical technician. What do you think, Thatcher, would kind of improve the chances that somebody would actually step forward and do something if they see an auto accident or they see God forbid, a bomb blast?
Sure. So
what's going to cause somebody to step forward?
So studies have shown that if nobody's helping, if there's a big group of people just kind of gathered around watching the incident, then it's less likely that somebody will intervene. But if that first person steps up and starts treating or starts doing something, intervening in some way, then more people are likely to do that. And then kind of based on that as well, if you were the only one on scene, there's not a bunch of bystanders, it's more likely that you would intervene. So I know there's a lot of reservations, hesitation that you don't want to be the first one to jump in there because nobody else is. And what if you do something wrong? What if you screw it up? But you just need to to go for it and recognize that no one's going to help probably until someone does.
Or maybe I'm not as qualified as somebody else, so I'll wait until somebody else steps forward. But if everybody's thinking that, then nobody steps forward.
Yeah, it's kind of like in the movies where they shout, "Is anybody here a doctor?" You know what I mean? Great, do that, but when nobody raises their hand, now it's you.
Right.
So,
and to the second point, I would my view of what would cause someone not to take action is, I think somebody else is more qualified. I'm afraid I might hurt them. And obviously we need to, or individually, we need to evaluate that. I think we heard in the video, if someone's in a life-risking situation, there's a pretty good chance we're not going to make it worse.
Absolutely.
By just using common sense and recognizing that we can indeed lend some help.
Yeah.
The Good Samaritan law.
Yeah, so the Good Samaritan law here in New Hampshire, and obviously I'm not an attorney, so you might want to run that by an attorney if you did have any questions. But essentially what it says is you can't be held liable for rendering care, doing something that a reasonable person would find reasonable. If you stopped and tried to pulled somebody out of a burning car, and they were in the process paralyzed because they had a spinal cord injury that you somehow made worse. You did something a reasonable person would do, which is pull somebody from a burning vehicle. So you have some immunities here in New Hampshire that you would be protected from civil suit for that because you were well-intentioned and doing something a reasonable person would do. Now, going back to my buddy MacGyver, if you watch TV medical shows and you're like, oh, this person's choking, I think I've got a penknife and I can do a tracheotomy here. You haven't been trained to do that. That's an entirely different scenario. So that's something a reasonable person wouldn't do.
So common sense should prevail.
Exactly. But the things that we're going to teach you today, basic bleeding control, moving the person, none of that would hold you liable here in the state of New Hampshire.
Good to know. And I think this video will make a lot of the points that we just discussed. If we could run the next video, please.
So like we talked about, everyone was kind of gathered around watching it, not knowing what to do. Then that one person stepped in, tried to start moving it, kind of was like, oh, well, I guess that's a little too heavy for me, backed off. Somebody kind of came in. We don't have any audio, obviously, but you can see that they kind of were like, all right.
All of a sudden, people responded.
Yep, let's do this. And they were able to pull that gentleman. That was a motorcycle accident where the driver of the motorcycle was actually under the car, and then as you can see, everything caught fire. So the story does have a happy ending. He did survive, even though he wasn't looking so good when they did pull him out. But yeah, and then the police officers were able to extinguish the fire shortly thereafter. But without the intervention of those,
the folks that were there, the bystanders.
Yeah, before the first responders got there, that outcome might have been quite different. So.
Right.
Yeah, and the impact to stress. So this is going back to the tunnel vision. You don't want to, just recognize that this is going to be a scary situation for you as well as it is for those who are sick or injured. So you don't want to get into that tunnel vision where, your heart's beating, your blood pressure's up there, and you just rush right in. We certainly, this program's encouraging you to help, but take a second, take a breath, recognize that this isn't normal for you, this isn't what you do every day, and look out for danger. You don't want to get hurt, yourself, because obviously you don't want to get hurt, but you're not doing anyone any good if you're just adding to the casualty count. So just recognize that this is a normal reaction, the stress reaction, and just try to take a second, take a breath, acknowledge it, and then move in.
Look at the whole situation and to make sure you're not endangering yourself.
Right. Yeah, and you can train your brain. So obviously first responders deal with these situations more often. Not to say that we're unaffected by them, but we recognize the impact of stress and take that step back, take a breath before we go rushing in. Yeah, and the key point, so you are the first link in that chain of survival. So if you don't do anything, it doesn't matter what kind of EMS crew you have on the way, what kind of ER you have, what kind of specialty care. You need to do something to get all of those on their way. And then have stress, and then just recognize you don't want to be part of the casualty count.
So what about 911? Does it work?
Absolutely. So here in New Hampshire, obviously you call 911 by a landline or with a cell phone 911 and call or send, whatever your particular phone says. And it's going to go to one of two locations. It's either going to go to the 911 center in Concord or Laconia. They're set up to be redundant, so if one went down, the other one could take over 100% of the call volume. But they will answer the phone, New Hampshire 911, what is your emergency? And then just tell them whatever you can. You don't need to be an ER physician and diagnose them, but they're sick or they got hurt with this way, or just tell them what you see. I need a police officer, there's a fire, I smell smoke, whatever it is, and they're gonna ask you a long list of questions. Sometimes it can be kind of frustrating because you're dealing with an emergency, right? And you wanna get off the phone. That's by design that they keep you on the phone, because you need to give us updates, us being the first responders, changes in a fire, changes in a patient's medical condition, the address. Landlines, we have E911. When you call 911 from a landline, it automatically pops up your name and address. But with a cell phone, that's not the case. So they want to make sure they get an accurate location so that the ambulance, the fire engine, the police officer can find you. So just recognize that if you choose to be the one that calls 911, that's probably going to be your one and only task in that chain of survival, because they're going to want to get a lot of information from you.
We had someone from the 911 center come to one of our CERT meetings and give a presentation, very informative. But I believe she also mentioned that given that in some parts of the state, cell service even can still be spotty, you can actually text 911 as well. Very often, a text will get through where a phone call won't. So it's important for people to understand, I think, that if your cell service is kind of spotty, you can actually still get in touch with 911 by sending them a text. And I believe it's as simple as texting to 911.
Yep, I haven't had to use it myself, but that's my understanding as well.
Right.
Or just think of other things. Some communities have pull stations, master boxes throughout the town. We don't have that here in this community, but every commercial occupancy has a fire alarm system. So if your cell phone wasn't to work for whatever reason, you could go into one of those businesses, pull the pull station by the front door. You're going to get a fire truck that shows up. If you need an ambulance, that might be frustrating, but like we talked about before, you will have medical personnel with medical equipment to get you started. And that's worst case scenario, your cell phone's not working.
What about a situation where I'm driving down the road, I see what is obviously a bad accident, but there's lots of other cars around. Should I assume somebody else called?
No, you do want to call. It's a good idea to call because they might be getting that tunnel vision we're talking about, where they're rushing in to take care of that person, comfort that person, and maybe they're assuming somebody did call. So 911 calls, multiple 911 calls is fine.
Okay,
and
so better they receive lots of calls than no call.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, sometimes even we'll get called for a car fire out on the Everett, you know, the interstate, and you'll be looking for it. It might be somebody who just overheated, pulled over for a second, and they keep going. If we only get a single call on that and we can't find that, that's oftentimes what the case is. But if we're on our way to a car fire and dispatch says, yep, we've got multiple calls on this, that's pretty good indication that it's real. Not to say we're going to treat it as not real till we get there, but if it kind of changes our thought process if we're getting 10 calls on it. Probably not 10 people calling about an overheated car.
So when in doubt, make the call.
Yeah, absolutely. It's only doing us a favor. And so we're going to listen to a 911 call from 911 call from Columbine High School. So this was 1999 when there was that school shooting there. And so it's a little uncomfortable to listen to, knowing the nature of what's going on. And this is a teacher in the library who had to call to report the two shooters.
It's uncomfortable. It's a little bit lengthy. But it's important, I think, to understand the interaction and the dialogue that takes place between the 911 operator and, in this case, a librarian in the library. Very informative. If we can have that video, please.
Jefferson County 911.
Yes, I am a teacher at Columbine High School. There is a student here with a gun. He has shot out a window. I believe one shot. I've been
Columbine High School.
I don't know what's in my shoulder. If it was just a raspy or what.
Okay, has anybody been injured, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And the school is in a panic, and I'm in the library. I've got students down under the tables, kids. Heads under the tables. Kids are screaming. Some of the teachers are, trying to take control of things. We need police here.
Okay, we're getting them there.
Police here.
Who is the student, ma'am?
I do not know who the student is.
Okay.
I saw a student outside. I was in hall duty. Oh, God. Okay. I was on hall duty. I saw a gun. I said, what's going on out there? And he said, oh, it's probably for video production. It's probably a joke. I said, well, I don't think that's a good idea. And I went walking outside. I think he was down to see what was going on. He turned the gun straight at us and shot. And my God, the window went out. And the kid standing there with me, I think he got hit.
Okay.
Something in my shoulder.
Okay. We've got help on the way, ma'am.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, God.
Stay on the line with me.
Oh, God. Hey, kids, just stay down.
Do we know where he's at?
I'm sorry?
Do we know where he's at?
Okay. I'm in the library. He's upstairs. He's right outside of here.
He's outside?
He's outside of this hall.
Outside of a hall or outside?
The hall.
Okay.
There are alarms and things going off now. Smoke. My God, smoke is like coming into this room.
Okay.
I've got the kids under the table here. I don't know what's happening in the rest of the building. Most of that smoke in the building. I don't know. I'm sure someone has to be calling 911 besides
Yes,
you.
we've got a lot of people on. Okay. I just want you to stay in the line with me. We need to know what's going on.
Okay.
Okay.
I am on the floor.
Okay. And you've got the kids
in the
there?
library. And I've got every student in this library on the floor. You better stay on the floor.
Is there any way you can lock the doors?
Smoke is coming in from out there, and I'm a little afraid. The gun is right outside the library door, okay? I don't think I'm going to go out there.
Okay, you're at Columbine High School?
I got 3 children.
Okay, we got it.
Okay? I'm not going to go to the door to shut the door, okay? I've got the kids on the floor. I got all the kids in the library on the floor.
We have paramedics, we have fire, and we have police en route, okay, sir?
Okay. Okay.
Yes.
I mean, I don't know. I can't believe he's not out of bullets. He just keeps shooting and shooting and shooting.
Okay. Yeah, we've got a police officer on scene.
I thought it was.
Okay, just try and keep the kids in the library calm.
Yeah.
Is there any way you can block the door so no one can get in?
I do not.
Okay.
I guess I can try to go, but I mean, he's right outside that door. I'm afraid to go to the door.
That's okay.
That's where he is. I'm not afraid to go there, okay?
That's okay.
Okay, I told the kids to get on the floor. I told them to get under the table. All of the children are on the floor under the table. Yeah, they're all under the tables.
Okay.
And
as long as we can just try and keep...
No one's saying a word.
Okay, as long as we can keep everyone there as calm as we can.
I hear some yelling out there going on right now.
Yeah, we've got alarms going off now as well.
Yeah, there's alarms. This room is filled with smoke.
Okay.
Okay.
Keep everyone low to the floor.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone's up. Okay. Everyone stay on the floor. Stay on the floor. Stay under the table.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, I know, just...
I don't know. I didn't... I said, what is that kid got? He was outside at the time. And I was on call duty. Oh, God. He's like, woo, woo, woo.
I know.
Things are being shut off. I do not know who the student was. I don't even think I saw him. He was wearing black. He didn't look very large. Male student. He was out there shooting. It looked like he was pointing out and shooting. And somebody, I said, what is that? I said, what's going on out there? This wiretap gun. It's probably for video production. You know, they do these video productions. And the kids, I said, well, that's not, you know, a play gun, a real gun. I was going out there to say no. And I went, oh my God, that was really close. That just rattled me.
Okay. What's your name, ma'am?
My name is Patty.
Patty?
Yelling everybody get up right now. Please go to the library. Keep hearing everybody get up right now.
Okay.
Please don't. Oh, I have him in the library shooting at students. The lady that I have in the library on the phone.
Okay, try and keep as many people down as we can. Okay. Do you know who he is? Okay.
Yeah, so as you can see, that was a really obviously stressful situation.
Real world situation.
Yeah,
there.
and you know, it's stressful anytime you call 911, but that one in particular. And she did an awesome job, you know. She was losing her mind there, but rightfully so. And she said, you know, there's a piece of glass or something. She got shot, unfortunately. I believe she did live,
right.
But so she was injured from a shooter and was still able to make that call. And put yourself in the dispatcher's shoes. Talk about common, very rare, rare. How often does a dispatcher deal with a shooting in a school? You know, so her stress level is up here too, just with the person calling. And so they both did a great job with a terrible situation. And I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe the Bedford Police Department would agree with me. If you're in a situation like that where you can't talk to 911 because you need to hide from a shooter,
right.
Leave the line on and do what you need to do. We would obviously prefer we be able to get that information from you, but don't endanger yourself by giving away your position by talking to the dispatcher. But leaving that line off the hook allows us a little bit of intel to be able to hear what's going on in the background. So don't just hang up on 911. If you can't talk to them, set the phone down.
Now, Thatcher, in this case, where I think the librarian was actually on the phone with the 911 operator for, I think it was like 12 or 15 minutes. For those not familiar with the 911 system, are they waiting until the end of that call before help gets dispatched?
That's a great point. No, they're not. So most dispatch centers, like we have here in Bedford, have at least 2 people operating it. So one of them's responsibility is to operate the radios. and the other one's responsibility is the phones.
Okay.
And so when you call 911, you're talking to the person who's operating the phones. So they're taking information from callers, and then the person on the radios is talking to police, fire, and EMS.
Okay.
So while I'm asking you more questions to get more information, my partner would have already dispatched the trucks, the personnel to get them there.
And help is on the way.
Exactly. So
Okay.
you'll get frustrated talking to that 911 operator, even if it's not an active shooter, if it's somebody who collapsed, because you're like, who cares, you know, I just need help. Help is on the way. We're just trying to get more information while we're doing that. We're multitasking in that sense.
Okay. Our next video is actually kind of closing this section on a somewhat lighter note. People often ask, is it okay for children to call 911? And I think the answer, you would agree, is absolutely. As soon as the kids are old enough to understand how to dial the phone, yes, they should know how to call 911. They should know what their address is. They should know how to ask for help, but not always ask for help about certain things.
That's right. And yeah, we tell kids, yep, you absolutely can call 911 if it's an emergency. We don't call it as a joke,
right?
And we don't practice calling it, but call 911 if you think you need police, fire, or EMS, you know,
right.
Describe what you will. So,
for an example of a little boy that needed some help, can we have the next video?
911 emergency. Yeah, I need some help.
What's the matter?
With my mouth.
Was your mouth?
No, it's my mouth. I have to do it. Will you help me?
Sure. Where do you live?
No, it's my mouth.
Yeah, I know it. Where do you live, though?
No, I want you to talk to me on the phone.
No, I can't do that. I can send someone else to help you.
Okay,
What kind of math do you have that you need help with?
I have takeaways.
Oh, you got to do the takeaways?
Yeah.
All right, what's the problem?
You have to help me with my math.
Okay. Tell me what the math is.
Okay, 16.
Yeah.
Take away 8.
Uh-huh.
Is what?
You tell me, how much do you think it is?
I don't know, 1.
No. How old are you?
I'm only 4.
4?
Yeah.
Yeah. What's another problem? That was a tough one.
Oh, here's one. 5, take away 5.
5, take away 5. And how much do you think that is?
5. Johnny, what are you doing? Just playing this off of me right now. What did I tell you about playing on the phone?
Your mother.
I need help. The car says that. I didn't mean the police.
Yeah, so like we talked about 911, calling 911, it's probably going to be your one and only job. It's going to be stressful.
Yep.
Try your best to keep calm and give the dispatcher as much information as they can. And like I said, you might get frustrated with some of the questions or the amount of questions, but they're following an algorithm, if you will, which based on your responses tells them what they need. Some communities have a tiered system where they won't necessarily send a paramedic truck to every call. They might have a basic life support ambulance respond, and then a paramedic can come intercept. Here in Bedford, you get a paramedic level ambulance anytime you call 911 for an ambulance, but these are dispatchers, the 911 operators for the entire state. So they're trying to do what's best for every community, and they need to think of the range of calls that they receive, police, fire, and EMS.
Right.
So do your best to take a deep breath, calm down, and give them as much accurate information as you can. And if you don't know something, you can certainly tell them that. Say, I don't know. Don't guess.
Right, good point. My understanding, Thatcher, is that the people staffing these phones are also medically trained. They may or may not be emergency medical technicians, but if I'm dealing with a situation where I've got a friend who I think is in the middle of a heart attack, they can actually help to talk me through what to do if I don't happen to know that, or if I see blood spurting out of a thigh, they can actually provide guidance. So they're not just glorified operators. They can actually provide remote help.
Absolutely, yeah. If we suspected that your friend was having a heart attack, they would coach you through giving them aspirin. if bleeding control, like you
Right.
said, basic hands-only CPR, they could help instruct with that as well. So yeah, there's quite a number of things that they do. So that's another reason they want you on the line.
Yep.
So here's some of the common questions that a 911 operator might ask you.
Yep.
In addition to your name, your address, nature of the emergency. They want to know where. You might be able to tell them, here today we're sitting here in BCTV. It's not that large of a building, but where in BCTV? If you're going to a 5-floor apartment, what floor, what apartment, what side? There's all sorts of information that could help. And like you said, they'll give you basic instruction on how to deal with the situation. And if you call and say, I smell smoke in my house, kind of goes without saying that you should get outside,
Right.
but they'll prompt you to do that too. So.
Okay. If you would, before we leave this slide, speak to the role that bystanders can play when emergency help is arriving. Somebody made the call,
Yep.
but somebody else very often needs to go stand by the street to help guide the ambulance, the fire truck, the police car, whatever, to the actual source of the emergency.
Yeah, so we say dealing with an emergency, let's say it's a medical condition or somebody gets hurt, is a minimum of 3 people to deal with that. So someone should call 911, and as we discussed, that's going to be your one and only job. Somebody should stay with the patient. Hopefully it's somebody with some medical training,
Right.
but if not, at the very least, this program,
Yep.
that would be a good job for you if you have gone through this and the other 2 have not. And the third person, like you said, could help guide the first responders in. So a lot of times we'll get called to, a big business and they'll say a person collapsed in aisle 17. I don't work there. I don't know where aisle 17 is. Yes, I can count 1, 2, 3, but maybe there's a better entrance if I saw somebody outside
Right.
waving me in. Now, with that being said, our first slide that we looked at of that overturned vehicle, we saw one guy multitasking because
Right.
sometimes you're by yourself. You don't have 3 people, so sometimes you might be on the phone with 911 and trying to comfort somebody. So, but 3 is best.
Good.
3 or more. So. And so here we have another motor vehicle accident. Another car rolled over on its roof. Nobody's here at the moment, like the last picture. So based on what we talked about earlier, Paul, if you were to come up upon this, nobody else is there, what are you thinking in your head? What do you want to do?
Well, the car is overturned, so I would think there's a very good likelihood that there are injuries. So I could probably assume that before I even peek in the window. In terms of information that I might like to relay to 911, I'm either on the eastbound or the northbound or the westbound side of this highway. I know where I was traveling. That would be helpful, I think. The fact that the car is overturned, I think, gives an indication of the severity. Once I get a little bit closer, I might be able to provide some guidance about how many people are inside the car. And with a little bit of a peek, I might be able to tell how severe their injuries are. Sometimes if everybody's all strapped in properly, they could get out and walk away from this. But sometimes if they weren't strapped in properly, this could be a very serious accident. I'd probably also want to know where on this highway I was. Did I just pass exit 47, or can I see up ahead of myself a little bit something that says mile marker 148? That, I would think, is all going to be useful information to guide the emergency responders to the exact location.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the big thing is, where is it? So like he said, this might be, it looks like it's out on the interstate. Where on the interstate? So there are mile markers, anything you can give us. Every 1/10 of a mile, there's a little green sign here in New Hampshire on the interstates that's a mile marker. If you can give us those exits, like you said, I just passed exit 6, I'm north of exit 6. That's a great indicator rather than us going up and down the length of the road trying to look for something. Landmarks, if you're not familiar with street names or anything like that. Trees aren't very good landmarks, or being like, I'm directly under the sun now, right? But if you can describe it, you might not know that BCTV is, 10 Meeting House Road, but I'm outside of BCTV. I'm across the street from the Bedford Library. The responders will know that address, so it's not important necessarily that you know the exact street address when it comes to something like this. And the other things that you hit on too, how many people are involved in this? Do I need to send multiple ambulances right from the start? Do we have only one person and they're standing outside of the car taking selfies next to it? We're going, hashtag wrecked, right? Are there any fluids on the ground? Is there any fire? This is all helpful stuff for first responders who are responding to this. And then the other part of it is too, like we talked about, then don't get hurt. Right. So if you are out on the interstate, that's one of the most dangerous things for first responders is getting hit by vehicles out on the interstate. Right. So try to, if you do decide to pull over, try to position your car and yourself in such a way that you're unlikely to get hit. And again, if you don't feel comfortable stopping, maybe you've got 2 little kids in the car and you would be worried about them. You don't have to stop, but at the very least, pick up the phone and call 911. Right. Don't assume that somebody else has.
Pull off when it's safe and make the call.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So, next topic deals with just personal safety. As we've emphasized, I think, a couple of times already, we don't want to make the situation worse. Your personal safety is and should remain paramount.
Absolutely. And so we talked about trust your gut, but also use your senses. Yep. What do you see? What do you smell? What do you hear? Just trust your instincts and your gut, though. Don't go running into a bad situation just because you want to help. Because even me, as a professional first responder, if I arrive on a scene and the first thing I do is get hurt, it would have been better if I had just stayed back at the office, right? Because not only am I not helping, but now I'm tying up.
Now you're another patient.
Exactly. I'm just tying up first responders. So
so
it's something I have to keep in mind as well.
I think we have some examples here.
We do. So, so we got another motor vehicle accident. So everything we talked about before, and now what do we see, smell, hear? What do you think?
Well, it looks like it probably happened a while ago. I see that dry oil, gasoline soak-up stuff, kitty litter or sand or something has already been spread. I've got an emergency tow truck is already on the scene. So I would expect, if I had just come up on this, I would expect that if there were any personal injuries, they're probably already dealt with. This looks like it's in cleanup stage.
Yeah, absolutely. So the fact that the tow truck is there already, I would guess that this is later on in the incident. Like you said, the fire department has probably been there because the speedy dry down on the ground.
Yep.
Unless somebody happened to be carrying that. Maybe the tow truck operator. But yeah, so like we talked about, we're going to smell some gas on the ground, some of that oil. We might hear the trucks running, the diesel engines. We might hear the tow truck. Traffic is another big thing. We want to watch out for traffic. Like you said, this scene has pretty much been mitigated at this point. Maybe the vehicle could move if you got too close to it, but the big thing here is to watch out for that traffic.
Eyes and ears open.
Absolutely. And so this one's a little bit different scenario, right? So the concert, it looks like
looks like a sound tower fell over, and I would assume, since I see people looking to lift it, I would assume that would imply that there's probably people underneath it that might be in need of some help. I don't see any first responders, so this probably was taken by somebody's cell phone that was at the concert. But this looks like not a well-developed situation. This looks like a situation that probably just happened. Fortunately, it looks like a number of people have responded to begin to lift that thing up.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I'm right there with you. I'm guessing they're trying to lift this up because somebody's underneath it, not like, it tipped over, the show must go on, right? So absolutely. So that's the first priority, is we got to get somebody who's trapped out from under that. Like you said, first responders aren't on scene yet. The gentleman in the back with the yellow shirt, I would assume that's event staff, event security, but probably not medically trained. So once we do get somebody out from underneath this, what would be our next focus? Get everybody away from this. If it fell over once, what's to say something else isn't going to collapse on us?
Again.
Yeah, we don't want a secondary collapse that maybe 5 people got hurt by this, but now, we're all high-fiving and congratulating each other for getting those 5 people out, and a secondary collapse now injures 20. So certainly help, but set the limitation. Yeah, so this one's starting to be a little bit more commonplace, right?
Right.
Because people are well aware of opiates and the epidemic that we're dealing with. But the point I'm bringing up that for is don't just jump to the conclusion that that's what's going on.
Right.
You know, unfortunately, there's been so much media attention about that. Whenever you see anybody down on the ground like this, your instinct is, oh, drugs or alcohol.
It's too easy to think the worst and
Right.
just say, well, if I try and help him, it's probably just a danger to myself, and he got what he deserved anyway.
Right. Yeah. It's easy to say that, and this is obvious. It looks like it's on a subway or a train,
Yep.
so it's a little bit more urban than Bedford typically. But if somebody was in hypovolemic shock, so
Yep.
somebody who was a diabetic, might they look like that?
Sure would.
Sure. Somebody who having a seizure, cardiac arrest, they could certainly look like that too. So we're not saying to completely let your guard down and assume that this isn't,
Right.
you know, drug or alcohol related. Certainly be cautious when you approach this person, but by all means, this person deserves
Right.
the same respect and treatment that
Sure.
the people that were in the
At
accidents
least,
do.
hey, buddy, you okay? Do you want some help?
Yeah.
And if he grumbles and says, get out of here, then you've at least, I think, done your job. You've
Yeah.
at least said, you've at least offered to assist. If he doesn't want, if he's well enough to say go away, then he probably doesn't need the assistance.
Yeah. Or if you're really nervous or cautious about it, you can certainly just call 911. We have
Got a guy down.
Probably a gentleman. Maybe it's hard to tell from here. You could get a little closer. Say gentleman, mid-30s, let's say.
Right.
Then there you go. You've at least helped.
Right.
You've
I'm
done
on the-
something.
I'm on the XYZ train in the
Exactly.
fourth car.
Yeah, maybe let the engine operator know so we don't have to then chase it around the city. We know where to find it.
Yep.
But yeah, if at the very least you don't feel comfortable going over and assessing this gentleman, call 911, get that help on the way.
Sure.
Yeah, so
That one looks nasty.
Yeah, lots to see, smell, hear, right?
I see a chainsaw falling right alongside this gentleman, looks like he's also about to get hit on the head by the ladder that he was just on shortly after he hits the ground. Bad stuff going on here.
Yeah, and so he's going to have a fall injury at the very least. Hopefully the chainsaw lands away from him so
Right.
we don't have the laceration as well. But a big thing with us approaching this scene is we need to look up.
Right.
You know, we see a ladder. The ladder is kind of perched precariously right now.
It could be hanging on a wire.
It could be, absolutely. Ladders, we always get concerned about overhead wires with
Sure.
ladders. And he's up there cutting limbs. So maybe he hasn't completely cut through one and he's just weakened it to a point where it could come down on us.
Right.
So again, not saying don't approach this gentleman, but certainly do your assessment of the situation before you go rushing in. And if you do see a log perched precariously, yeah, he fell, so maybe he does have a spinal cord injury, but moving him just a few feet away so he doesn't get injured by something else,
Right.
I think the risk, the benefit of that outweighs the risk of a spinal cord injury.
As you said earlier, we need to avoid the tunnel vision. It would be very easy to focus on the gentleman lying on the ground, hurt, moaning, and not take the time to look up.
Yep.
And understand the entirety of the situation before moving in to help him.
Yeah, and if the chainsaw is still running,
Might be a good idea to turn it off.
yeah, just shut it off for no other reason than to help call 911.
Sure.
Obviously, we don't want somebody to come in contact with a running chainsaw, but if it's just over there puttering in the background, it's not doing any help to the situation. Yep, and before taking action, like we talked about, use your best judgment, use your senses, but at the same time, you've got that instinct, you've got that gut feeling for a reason, trust it.
Right.
You know, like we talked about, if you do nothing else other than call 911 because you're like, I don't know, you know, that wire is there, that I don't feel comfortable, let the professionals come in and do it, but get them on their way.
Right. And again, I think the folks at home should see a common theme to a number of comments we've made about, is it safe for you? And if it's safe for you, then begin to take some action. If it's not safe for you, at a minimum, call 911. Do a little bit if you can, but don't put yourself at risk either. And again, there are first responders who are fully trained, whose job it is to put themselves at risk, that's not us. As the first person on the scene, except for the rare exception when the first responder happens to be on the scene first, in most cases, the ordinary folks like us don't have the kind of training to run into the burning building or chase down that active shooter. That's a job best left for somebody else. So what about moving people? Everybody's, I think, often afraid if they see it might be an auto accident, it might be a fall. We've all been told about, be very careful. Don't try and move them. You might make things worse. Can you speak to that?
Sure. Yeah, I heard that growing up too. Even before I had my license, I remember my dad telling me, like, if somebody's in a car accident, you never move them because they will be paralyzed. Right. And so that's, although that is a possibility, it's a small possibility. But something to keep in mind, if somebody's involved in a car accident and they can't get out of the vehicle, if they're in a relatively safe situation, best to leave them there so that we can move them cautiously with the appropriate equipment, the appropriate assessment. But if the car is on fire or that motorcyclist is laying in the middle of the road and might then get run over, absolutely move that patient. It's unlikely that you're going to give them a spinal cord injury if they didn't already have one. Right. But even if you did, I would assume that they would choose that over
getting run over by that truck.
Exactly. Yeah. But if you do have to move somebody, like that slide was showing, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can carry them with the help of others. If you have a blanket or something like that, you can roll them onto that. You can drag that. If they're in a chair, you could pick up the chair. You don't want to just grab them by an arm and just kind of start. Yeah, or especially the head. If you do have an extra person to help keep the head stabilized, because that's where that spinal cord fracture comes from, is if you break a bone in your back. That's not the issue necessarily, is that a piece of the broken bone then severs the cord, which is irreparable. So
I think we're seeing in the top picture, fortunately there were several people available to help move this person. The gentleman on the left is obviously cradling the head to ameliorate the situation that you just described.
Yep, and so that's the best case scenario, but if you don't have that, you don't have that, and just move them. Do the best you can.
Bleeding, our favorite topic.
Yeah, so now we're going to talk about some bleeding control. So again, this isn't designed to make you an EMT, but there is a lot you can do to help us with bleeding control. So if any blood that's lost can't be replaced until
can't put it back in.
Can't put it back in until they're in the emergency room. Then they can start putting blood back in. We don't have blood in the ambulance. We only have saline, but saline doesn't carry oxygen and carbon dioxide. So the best chance for survival is, like you said, to keep the blood in. Don't let it out. So we'll talk about how to do some basic bleeding control.
Can we see this video, please?
If you see somebody and you're like, wow, that's a lot of blood, or wow, that's a lot of bleeding, you should do something. That's significant bleeding. What happens is it's all about the amount of blood loss. We have a set amount of blood in our bodies, based on your size and other things. Generally 5 to 6 liters of blood. We know from medical science and studies at what point your body starts to have not enough, blood, to the point where it's causing physiologic problems, it's causing problems. That starts around 500 cc, about half a liter to a liter of blood. Once we get below, if you've lost 2 liters of blood, and 3 to 5 minutes is pretty fast to lose that amount. It's more like probably 10 to 15 minutes in bad bleeds. But once you get to that point, and then beyond that, potentially, you can go into a state of what we call irreversible shock. And essentially, if the tank doesn't have enough gas in it to keep the engine running, irreversible shock is irreversible. Which means it doesn't matter what we do. It doesn't matter how good your trauma center is. It doesn't matter how good your doctors are. It doesn't matter how good your paramedics are. It doesn't matter. Once you start that physiologic process of irreversible shock, it continues. We can't break that cycle, and you will die, or the person will die. the point, the only treatment for irreversible shock is prevention of irreversible shock. Don't let them get to that point. That blood belongs in the body. It doesn't belong on the street, right? It belongs in the body. So let's keep it there. No matter how we do it, let's keep it there.
All right. So like he said, irreversible shock is irreversible.
Right.
So like we said, the best thing to do is to just keep the blood in the body, and you could, you know, bleed out in just a couple minutes depending on the severity of the injury. So we talked about earlier, national average for EMS response, 6 to 9 minutes. That's a lot of blood. If you don't do anything, theoretically somebody could bleed out before EMS arrives, and then that link in the chain of survival has been broken. It doesn't matter how good the crew is, doesn't matter how good the ER is. The one concern about bleeding control is bloodborne pathogens.
Right.
So obviously bloodborne pathogens, depending on what somebody may have, could be transferred to you, for lack of a better term. So if you have a basic first aid kit that you want to keep in your car, gloves, some nitrile gloves are huge. That's what we use to protect ourselves from bloodborne pathogens. Anywhere, any mucous membrane, whether it be your nose, your mouth, your eyes, cuts in your skin, those could be transmitted if you got blood there. So depending on if you know the person real well, or it's a family member and you know that they don't have any of these diseases that you would want to be concerned about, your HIV, your Hep C, you know, then absolutely. But if it's a perfect stranger, it's always best to err on the side of caution. You know, it sounds a little cynical, but assume everybody has something. Just, you want to protect yourself.
But not everybody carries nitrile gloves in their glove compartment.
Yep.
I expect there might be other things in the car that I could kind of slip my hands into. It might be a plastic bag. It might be that roll of doggy bags that I carry when I'm walking Fido.
Yeah, exactly. Look, the nitrile gloves are the best, but yeah, you can certainly, like you said, makeshift, improvise some stuff. We saw in the first video with the motorcyclist down, the gentleman took off his shirt for some bleeding control.
Right.
Now, is blood eventually going to soak through a shirt? Absolutely, but for a couple of minutes, would that be a makeshift barrier and bleeding control device? Sure. Or the doggy bags or your cling wrap that you just bought at the grocery store.
And I guess we've all heard that, you know, that when we come on a scene, spurting blood is bad. That means we're dealing with an artery, and that blood's going to be bright red. It's going to be coming out, basically matching the heartbeat, and that's when somebody's losing a lot of blood.
Yes.
Blood darker, kind of dripping out, more likely to be venous blood. Not that it doesn't need to be controlled, but it's less of an issue.
Correct. So you nailed it. So arterial blood is any artery is a blood vessel leaving the heart. And then veins are blood vessels that return blood to the heart. So big difference there is the pressure, right? Like you said, an arterial bleed is pretty much going to match their heart rate because it's under pressure. So yeah, it's going to be a little bit brighter, theoretically more oxygenated, but they're going to bleed out even faster. You know, take my water bottle I have here. If I take the cap off and turn it on the side, is some going to come out? Absolutely. But if I squeeze it, is it going to come out even faster?
Right.
And that's essentially what we're dealing with between the difference between venous and arterial bleeds. Like you said, venous bleeds need to be controlled too, but you might have theoretically a little bit more time.
So what do we do about it? I think we should cue up this video, please.
Pressure stops bleeding. It's one of those things in medicine that we've known for a long time. It's one of the things that you know, that's a truth in medicine that's true today, and it'll be true in 100 years. Pressure stops bleeding. So what we really want the citizen to do, how do you stop bleeding if you're on the side of the road or in the middle of the woods and waiting for someone to come help you, is you have to put pressure on the bleeding. There's a couple things about that people need to understand. Number one, you got to understand a little bit about the anatomy. The major blood vessels, the ones that will cause bleeding to the point where you're going to die, are always deep under the skin near the bone. So they're always down, and they run right along major bones. That means that you have to apply a lot of pressure. It's not just a little bit of pressure, it is a significant amount of pressure. Number two, it may cause some discomfort, and that's okay. You're not doing any damage, you're not hurting them, you're actually saving them. And number 3, you have to hold it for a long time, right? You have to make sure you're holding pressure for long enough that the clotting process starts. How long is that pressure? As long as you can. I mean, it's until we get there, you know, or until you can't hold it anymore. What people have a tendency to do is they want to come up and put a bandage on a bleeding wound. A bandage doesn't stop bleeding. All it does is soak up blood. And again, that blood that it's soaking up into that bandage, it should be in your body. It shouldn't be being soaked into the bandage. We want it to stop. So before you put the bandage on, before you make something look pretty, you want to put pressure on it, and that pressure is what works. If you don't get the bleeding stopped, even if you slow the bleeding, maybe you buy that person enough time until we can get there and completely control the bleeding. And then some bleeding can't be controlled. The wounds are too big, the artery is too large, the vein is too large. That's where we look at tourniquets, right? And even still, if you have a wound that needs a tourniquet, I want to put pressure on it while I'm getting the tourniquet in place. Because if you're free-flowing blood while I'm working on getting my tourniquet, you're dying while I'm getting my tourniquet in place. We want to stop the dying. We stop the dying by stopping bleeding with pressure, and then we apply the tourniquet, which then further controls it. That's the key.
So, basic bleeding control, if you've ever taken a first aid course, I don't know, have you?
I have.
Okay.
Multiple.
All right. What did they teach you? What do you remember? There's a couple different things you can do depending on the nature or severity of it.
Again, depending upon the nature or severity, one is just pressure.
Yep.
If I have a Band-Aid, if I've got a first aid kit in the car, just as much pressure as possible, and if as one Band-Aid gets a little Band-Aid or one
bandage,
bandage gets soaked, just keep on piling them on. Don't take the wet one off and put a dry one on. That's just reversing the whole process.
Yeah.
But keep layering them on. And if you don't have a bandage, look around for something clean that might suffice. You know, I'm wearing a clean T-shirt. Maybe I can just take my T-shirt off and use that to press into the wound. And again, you know, to our earlier conversation, if I can do all that wearing gloves or introducing some barrier between myself and the bandages, that's a good thing. And for my understanding is that in most cases, just putting fairly significant pressure on can, if not stop, at least slow the bleeding sufficiently to allow time for the emergency responders to get there.
Absolutely. So, like, let's say I've got an injury right here on my arm. I want to provide some of that direct pressure, like you said, direct pressure with bandages. And as they get soaked, like you said, we don't take them off. We just keep piling them on, because if you start taking them off, any clot that was starting to form has now been removed. It's kind of like picking a scab, right?
Ooh.
Yeah. So we want to do some direct pressure with some bandages. You can elevate the injury if you can. If you put it above the level of the heart, then that's going to help a little bit, because now the heart isn't going to have as much pressure. Gravity is not your friend in that case. And then, have you ever learned to use a tourniquet before?
I've been to a couple of classes, but I'm sure our folks at home could benefit from hearing more about how to do that.
All right, so a tourniquet, if you have taken a course before, they probably told you that tourniquet's a last resort, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so try everything else first. And
Absolute last thing you do, and if you put it on, after a few minutes you should take it back off, because otherwise they'll lose the arm. Or the leg, or the whatever. That's what I was told years ago.
Yep, and that's what we were taught, you know, back in the day as well. But now they're actually saying tourniquet first. So they used to think that if you ever applied a tourniquet to an extremity, that the extremity would be lost, but the person's life would be saved.
Right.
Now their studies are showing that a tourniquet can be applied for up to 8 hours without any damage being done to the limb other than the injury that was already done to it.
Right.
So a lot of people don't have tourniquets. We'll talk about how to apply a tourniquet, but there's some makeshift tourniquets you can do as well. So here I have a commercial tourniquet that we carry in our ambulance. These are available on Amazon if you were so inclined. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be a medical professional to purchase these. And so you can apply this to yourself, or you can apply it to someone in need. But basically what we're doing is, let's say my injury is right here, so I want to make sure I apply the tourniquet above
the injury.
Because this is just basically clamping down on those veins and arteries and keeping the blood in my core, where I'm going to keep all of my major organs perfused.
In the case of your arm, where is your artery?
My artery, brachial artery, it runs deep, and if you feel kind of your bicep, you can feel it on yourself if you'd like. You can feel it there. And so that's basically what we're doing. It's the same thing as like a pressure point where we're trying to occlude that vein, but we're doing it with this device.
So it's in deep by the bone.
It's in deep, yeah. So
because
arteries...
because it's in deep, you need to really squeeze down.
Exactly. So arteries by design, if you will, are deep so that they're less prone to injury, right? Where veins are the ones that are on the surface. So that's something also to keep in mind if you're not sure if you have a venous bleed or an arterial bleed, depending on how bad the injury is. That's a good indicator. So then this device right here is just what they call the windlass, and this is what we use to tighten it down. So you spin it a few times, and the question is always, how many times do I turn it? And until bleeding is stopped, right? For depending on how tight you initially got it on there, or how big my arm is, it might take 5 turns, it might take 8 turns, and then to keep it, you put it there, you can put that over there. It's always good to try to document best you can when somebody gets a tourniquet applied. You don't have to be down to the exact minute, but if you do apply a tourniquet, just kind of try to keep in mind like, oh, it was 8 o'clock, something like that. Because we talked about there can be on for 8 hours.
But also in terms of how tight do you make it? I mean, someone that you're applying it to might go, ow, that hurts.
Yep.
And given the alternative is that person bleeds out, you might just say, yes, it hurts, I'm sorry, got to do it.
Yep,
you know,
absolutely.
This is at this point, this is saving your life.
Absolutely, and their adrenaline, if they need a tourniquet, their adrenaline's probably going to be pumping. It might not hurt as much as you and I practicing on each other. But yeah, they might say, ouch, that hurts, just like you applying that direct pressure might hurt. Right. And so a lot of people, like we talked about, don't necessarily have a tourniquet in their first aid kit.
Shame on me, I don't have one in my car.
Yeah, but something that you might have is a triangular bandage, or a cravat, they call it. And
part of my first aid kit.
Yeah, so it's called a triangular bandage because it is so shaped as a triangle.
Just look like a triangle.
Yeah, so triangle, cravat. So these can be used for a lot of things. So these can be used for bandages.
I've seen them used for a broken arm, to
yeah,
cradle the arm.
Yep, if you tie a knot in the corner, you can make it into a sling and swath. You can tie this around injuries for bandaging, hold bandages down if you didn't want to apply that direct pressure. But we can also turn it into a tourniquet. If you loop this over somebody's arm, this is just an overhand knot, we call it in the fire service, but it's basically like the first step in tying your shoes. So, but we call it an overhand knot. I don't know what it's actually called. And so that's how we start. But now, remember I had that windlass?
Right.
I need something to help me tighten it down.
Oh, look, there's a stick on the ground.
Yeah, it could be a stick. It could be a rolled up newspaper. It could be a pen. Who doesn't have a pen, right? And so then we just do one more overhand knot. And obviously this is a lot easier when you're not applying it to yourself.
If you're applying it to somebody else, all of this gets a whole lot easier. Right?
Yes. Do you mind just pulling? I'll hold the pen there if you want to just pull on those two.
Trying to find where the two.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay.
So now that acts as my windlass, and I can just sit here, and I can turn that, and I can actually feel that getting tighter. That's actually tighter than the commercial tourniquet was.
Ouch, it hurts.
And then I just have to tie one more overhand knot, and there you go. I've got a tourniquet, because we don't expect everybody has a tourniquet in their vehicle.
Right.
But you should, especially if you're taking this program, you should have a basic first aid kit with at least some gloves and some triangular bandages.
And we will talk a little bit later about the kinds of things that you want to carry in your car, just in case you were faced with an emergency.
Yeah, and the other part about tourniquets is they're only for extremities, so arms and legs. Right. Obviously, there's no way to tourniquet my core, and if I had a head injury, we don't want to tourniquet the neck.
Do not put a tourniquet around the neck.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. You can apply some direct pressure to the neck if you need to. Obviously, you don't want to encompass the neck, like choke me, but if I had an injury on one side, you could apply some pressure to one side, but not both. The core, you can apply pressure to. Right. But yeah, just bandages, apply pressure. Okay. Don't take it off.
This is a good summary, but I think we've talked through all these items already. And again, if I was to go to Amazon, what would I pay for one of those tourniquets?
I'm not sure, but I think
a couple of bucks.
Yeah, they're anywhere from like $6 to maybe 30, depending on what price. But
good investment to have in the car.
Yeah, and yep, like we talked about. Makeshift tourniquets.
Lots of other
That's what you're looking for. Yeah, out in the wilderness, I could theoretically rip my shirt and find a stick, and same thing. It's just a couple basic knots, an overhand knot, the first step in tying your shoes, and you just need that solid object to help you spin and tighten it down.
And who doesn't have a couple of bungee cords in their car, or a length of rope or something like that? It could also be used.
Yep.
We will move on.
Yeah, positioning the injured. So this is a relatively short topic, but there is what we call the recovery position. And so what that is you turn the person onto their side, and then you're able to position their arms and legs in such a way that they won't flop back over onto their back.
Okay.
Because them laying on their back, our big concern is they can't secure their airway.
Right.
So
particularly if they're not conscious.
Yes. Yeah.
The tongue, I understand, can slip back and block the airway.
Yeah. Your tongue could go loose and kind of flop back in your mouth. If somebody vomits or they have blood in their mouth, they could, asphyxiate.
Right.
So we turn them on their side, let gravity help us this time, and it would come out of their mouth. And me as a first responder, if I'm showing up at a multi-patient incident and I see somebody in the recovery position, we'll talk about that in a minute. It's not a very natural position to end up in, so I'm not going to assume that that's how the person ended up unassisted. I'm going to assume that that patient has been assessed, and I can...
Somebody's already been there.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so it will allow self-management, absolutely. Don't force anipody to do anything.
Right. Hey, get over here, lie down.
Yep. And people will naturally, I believe the next slide talks about tripoding.
Right.
So if somebody's short of breath, they're having a hard time breathing, they naturally have that tendency to tripod where they're trying to lean forward.
Yep.
It loosens the accessory muscles in your chest with gravity again, and actually makes it easier for you to inhale and exhale. So the woman on the left, you might think it looks like she's getting positioned to stand herself up, right? And your instinct might be, no, stay down, you're hurt, but without even knowing it, people kind of just hunch over into that position. If you get done running your 5K, you might feel yourself
we all kind of go to that position when we need extra air.
Yep, absolutely, and there's a reason you're doing that. It makes it easier to breathe. If you want to try it just sitting at home, you can kind of feel your muscles loosening up. And yeah, real basic assessment, if somebody's unconscious, are they breathing? No, then they need some CPR. Do you know it? Yes, then you can render it. If not, you can do what you can.
Right. So Thatcher, what do we do in a situation where we come upon someone, we've assessed their situation, looks like they're not bleeding, but we've checked for a pulse, we've checked for breathing, and it looks like we have neither. What do we do?
All right, so we want to then provide CPR. So we are teaching hands-only CPR now to bystanders. A lot of people wouldn't provide CPR in the past because they didn't want to put their mouth on a stranger's mouth, understandably so. But the human body has oxygenated blood in it if you've just collapsed. But we need to get that blood moving around by doing compressions to pump the heart. So we've decided, we've assessed them, we can look, listen, feel for breathing. We don't think they're breathing. We can check for a pulse if we want, but if they're not breathing, they probably don't have a pulse. And you talked about we can lift the head, so we can do the head tilt, chin lift, and then we just want to go to the sternum, right in the center of the chest, and we just want to start doing compressions. Push hard, push fast, and don't stop until help arrives, because we're moving around that already oxygenated blood. Although for professional rescuers, the ratio is 30-2, so you're supposed to do 30 compressions and then 2 rescue breaths. We use a bag valve mask, it's called. If you are by yourself as a bystander, don't worry about that. Just keep going. And how fast do we want to push? We want to do at least 100 beats per minute. And so there's a song that can help you remember what 100 beats per minute is. And it's Staying Alive by the Bee Gees. Right? You can get into it. You can tell by the way I walk. Right? So that's 100 beats per minute. For those of you who are a little bit more morbid, the song by Queen, Another One Bites the Dust, is also 100 beats per minute. But like we said, push hard, push fast, and don't stop until help arrives. There's always concern of what if I break a rib? You very well may break a rib, but if somebody is not breathing and their heart's not beating, a broken rib is the least of their concerns. Or what if in my excitement, we talked about the adrenaline, my hands are shaking, I don't know if I felt a pulse or not. not. If you start doing compressions on somebody and they don't need compressions, believe me, they're going to tell you. They're going to be like, oh, get off of me, because CPR hurts. But that's hands-only CPR. Push hard, push fast, and don't stop until professional help is there, or the patient wakes up and tells you to stop because they don't need CPR.
And we're up to our last module, providing comfort.
Yeah, so
maybe the most important.
Yeah, absolutely. So providing comfort, there's a huge psychological component to this, where just being with that person and telling them help is on the way. I'm not going to leave you. What's your name? This is, my name is.
Yep.
You just that bond. Just think of what you might
Sure.
want if you were involved in that situation. Would you want somebody to just call 911 and be 10 feet away from you, being like, or do you want that person to say, help's on the way? Yep. I talked to 911. They told me to do this.
Maybe just hold my hand.
Yeah, absolutely.
Simple things.
Yeah, that's powerful.
I think
stuff.
the key is you just mentioned it, is put yourself in their position. What would you want someone to say and do? And top of the list is, how can I help you? The answer might be, hey, I'm fine.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
Appreciate the offer, Thatcher, but I'm good. Leave me alone. Don't start putting me into a comfortable position and
right. Yeah.
and doing things to me that violate my space. If I'm okay, I'll tell you I'm okay.
Yeah, and that's like you said, big part of that is, if they're fine, they're fine.
Right.
Other things that people have asked of, I've gotten to render aid as a first responder and as a bystander before. Motor vehicle accidents, maybe their dog was in the back seat.
Sure.
And they are losing their mind until they know their dog is safe.
Right.
Because they're just thinking, oh, Fido's going to go and he's going to get hit by a car.
Out
Or
running
how
in
is he? And so you go and you take that dog and you put it in your car and say, yep, Fido's in the back of the car. Do you have a family member I can bring him to? That piece, that weight off their mind is huge. And who knows? You don't know what it is until you ask
Sure.
them, what is it I can do to help you? And like you said, it might be nothing. It might be, stay away from me.
Yep.
Okay. You
Yep.
know, everybody's a little bit different. And so keeping them warm is a huge one too. So we live in New England. So even in July, it
can be cool in
the
evening.
And somebody who is injured, you typically find them on the ground, right? So the ground is the coldest place to be. Survival, if you have to sleep out in the woods, they recommend you get off the ground somewhat. So the ground is always cold, even in the summertime. So you could theoretically get hypothermia here in New Hampshire, not in the winter. It is possible, especially if somebody was wet or something like that. But going back to our bleeding control, keeping somebody warm actually helps with clotting.
Really?
So yeah, it's one of the elements of the clotting cascade, they call it. And so your body actually clots better when you're warm. So don't be afraid to throw the blanket on somebody.
Might be July, but put a blanket over that person.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the I'm chilly part of it, so now I feel warmer. There's the psychological part of it, who doesn't love a warm blanket.
Sure.
And then there's they're actually gonna do better off with their bleeding by covering them with that blanket.
Interesting.
So. And I think you would recommend that as part of somebody's emergency kit or first aid kit.
Absolutely.
They have a blanket in the car. If you don't want to take up that much space, buy one of the space blankets, they call it.
They fold up into a little 3x3-inch package.
Yeah, absolutely, and they keep things super warm. So we recommend you have that in your car for you if you break down, but don't be afraid to cover somebody with that. Or, if you've got that blanket that you don't think is necessarily the cleanest, don't be afraid to put that on the person to help keep them warm.
My sense is everybody's got one of them in the trunk of their car, because when you're loading firewood or whatever, I don't want to get my nice clean car dirty, so we all have an old blanket that's in the back of the car.
Exactly.
It can serve multiple purposes.
Right, and you might be embarrassed to give it to a house guest to use for the night. Absolutely, but for providing comfort and
might
warmth,
save a life.
Absolutely. There you go. For those of you who are unfamiliar, that is a space blanket.
It's kind of thin aluminum foil.
Yeah, and you look at it and you're like, really? This is going to keep somebody warm? But if you ever used one, it gets toasty under there.
For the physics people, it reflects radiant heat.
There you go. And
What about kids?
Yeah, so working with kids is obviously a whole other dynamic. So you want to get down to kids on eye level. You know, they're shorter than us, so you don't want to talk down to them literally. So, you know, getting down on a knee. These people, kids, really pick up on your anxiety. So I know you're going to be anxious, but try your best to remain as calm as you can with them. Don't, you know, use simple words. You know, don't speak in medical jargon. You know, and they really need the assurance more than the adults.
I think the picture we're looking at happens to be Sandy Hook, unfortunately.
Yep. So I talk about you know, a terrible situation for sure. So
some pretty distraught kids.
Yeah, so do your best you can. Here in Bedford, whenever we do a fire drill at one of the elementary schools, the kids, when they evacuate, they line up facing away from the building.
Interesting.
So that if there were to be an emergency, they don't pick up on the teacher's anxiety of, look away, kids, look away. They're just trained to do that, and that's why they implemented that, is so kids don't pick up on, why do we always look at the building when nothing's going on, but today we're doing something different. So, I mean, obviously, you're not going to be able to have that routine with children, but just something to keep in mind.
That's interesting. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. And I didn't come up with that.
Okay.
I can't take credit for it. That was something they came up with across the district, and it's great.
What about people that have special needs?
Yeah, people with special needs, don't assume that they need your help, though. That's the thing. With this program, they might, because we're talking about people who are getting injured or ill, and especially like mass events. But just because somebody's in a wheelchair doesn't mean that they need your help getting around. Certainly ask, but kind of like we talked about, if you ask that person who doesn't have a disability, do you need help, and they say no, you need to respect that. And then other things we think about, functional needs, and even take somebody who is elderly. Don't assume that all elderly people are deaf or hard of hearing, and you have to get in their face and, sir, I'm here to help.
Can I help you?
You know, they'll be like, yes, thank you. Not not deaf, but thank you for assuming that, just because you know, I'm a little bit older than you. So yeah, something to keep in mind, that somebody might have some functional needs. That might mean they already have some sort of health issue prior to some sort of incident, prior to that car accident. Something to keep in mind, but don't just necessarily assume. Kind of like that gentleman down on the subway. Don't assume that that's drug or alcohol related. Don't assume that this person is, you know, incapable of doing something just because they have a disability. So.
Interesting. So, to summarize.
Yep, so we want to keep people warm. It's comforting psychologically, and it also works on the physiology of lessening the impact on the body and helping with bleeding control. And yeah, it's always courteous to ask permission from somebody before you go and touch them, before you assess them. And yeah, be respectful if they say no. One of the things, we always actually have to ask permission on the ambulance before we touch somebody, right? Even though it's kind of implied they want our help because they call 911. I don't just walk into your house and go, hey, how's it going? Lift your shirt up with the stethoscope, start listening to your lungs. I always just say, hi, my name's Thatcher. I'm on the ambulance. What's your name? Oh, Paul, nice to meet you, Paul. Do you mind if I take your pulse and your blood pressure? Will you tell me what's going on? Obviously, you're not going to be doing that, but you can say, hi, I'm Paul. Is there anything I can do to help you? Don't just grab the person and be like, I'm putting you in the recovery position. Because again, we talked about the recovery position is really for the unconscious person. But yeah, even if somebody is horrifically injured, it's always nice to
ask before you enter their space.
Exactly.
Okay, we're beginning to wrap up here. In terms of things that all of us can do at home in order to enhance our skills and improve our ability to respond, take a first aid class. They're offered by the Red Cross all the time. Usually as part of a first aid class, you'll hear about a lot of the things that we've talked about today: how to stop bleeding, how to do basic CPR, how to use an automatic defibrillator. We didn't talk about that today, but for someone with a heart condition, an AED can very, very often be life-saving. There is an organization established under national FEMA auspices called the Medical Reserve Corps. These are people who, again, serve as second responders in the community, but they have a distinctly medical focus. In some cases, they're nurses. They might be people who are CPR trained. They might be people who happen to be EMTs. A third alternative is the Community Emergency Response Team. As I indicated earlier, Bedford has a CERT team. I am fortunate enough right now to be the director of that team. As a CERT member, you'll go through a lot of skills training, from CPR and first aid to search and rescue training to traffic management to the basics of fire response and a range of other topics. We spend probably more time doing training actually than we do on anything else. So again, it gets back to the comment we made earlier about training your brain to the extent that you are better trained to respond. When faced with an emergency, you're more likely to actually get out and do something. Most of our program today has dealt with kind of critical, sudden emergency situations, car accidents, fires, bombs, gunshots, etc. But the emergencies that we are frankly much more likely to face are the kinds of things that we've seen here in Bedford in the last couple of weeks. We lose power at home. We all remember some of the severe ice storms that we've had. And as the very first responder, you need to worry about yourself and your family, and you need to worry about being prepared to help yourself at home. The emergency management folks would tell you that you need to be able to be self-sufficient, and that means fully self-sufficient at home for at least 24 to 48 hours. And that means you need to have water on hand. You need to have non-perishable food on hand. Ideally, some sort of an off-grid power source. One of the most key things is either a battery or a human-powered radio. Bedford now has its own radio station. In the case of an emergency, that's probably where you will most likely hear kind of the status of what's going on and things that you should be doing. Have some sort of an off-grid heating method. It might be as simple as your fireplace. Be very sensitive, obviously, to improper use of heating internally. Don't turn on your gas stove and think that that's going to heat your house. What it's more likely to do is to kill you and your family. But have a safe off-the-grid heating method for your home. Similarly with cooking, keep a camp stove handy, in a corner of the basement, and have some fuel safely stored, ready for it. Or if you've got a barbecue grill in a pinch, it's amazing what we can cook on a barbecue grill. Have some candles or some sort of a lantern with safely stored fuel. If you've got a family, particularly with some little ones, have some activities in mind to help pass the time. Obviously, don't forget about the four-legged members of the family, and don't forget about appropriate medicine sources. For those of you not familiar with NIXL, it is actually a national-wide program that will send alerts to your cell phone. I get them all the time from the Bedford Police Department. I get some from Manchester, and you'll get postings about the following incident just occurred in time. Something happened in Bedford just recently where power went down. I got a couple of NIXL alerts on my phone so that I knew, hey, it's not just me, there's a town-wide activity going on. So if you're not already signed up for NIXL, Google NIXL, N-I-X-L-E, and it'll take you to a place where you can sign yourself up. That's how to be prepared at home. We've talked a little bit about being similarly prepared in your car. Keep a small bottle of water available with you when you're out driving. You should have a simple first aid kit, things like flashlights and jumper cables. A couple different kinds of gloves. If you have to change a tire, it's nice to have some heavy-duty work gloves. If you come into an emergency situation, it's nice to have a pair of latex or nitrile gloves to further protect you. Have some basic equipment that will help you deal with a flat tire should you get one and be away from assistance. Don't assume that AAA is necessarily going to be able to get to you right away. If you're in a bad enough weather environment, AAA might not get to you for a couple of days. In the winter, add to your pack a small foldable shovel, some fluid for your windshield wipers, a scraper to get the ice off, and maybe a small bag of kitty litter or sand or something that can help you get, pardon me, a little extra traction if and when you get stuck on the ice. So, I've spoken a little bit about the Bedford Community Emergency Response Team. Who are we? We're Bedford folks just like you, and we're trained in the basics. I sometimes describe us as second responders. We're not rushing into burning buildings. We're not chasing down active shooters, but we are available in emergencies to do the kinds of things that need to get done in those emergencies, such that the pros, people like Thatcher, people like the members of the police department, will be freed up to do what they do best. He's trained in emergency as an EMT. Our police department is trained to do what police departments do. We take some of the load off their activities so that they can do what they do best. The other thing that we do, in addition to being second responders, is outreach and awareness to Bedford residents on topics just like until help arrives. If you have an interest in joining CERT, we are always looking for new members. You can find us at our website at www.bedfordnhcert.org. And there's an info email. If you drop a note to that info email expressing your interest, that will show up straight in my mailbox. So we'd love to have you join. That concludes our program. I thank you very much. My thanks to Thatcher Plante from the Bedford Fire Department for lending his expertise. Thanks again for watching. It's been a long program, but I hope it's been worthwhile. Thank you very much.
Thank you.